Meera shook her head. No, he kept that side of his life away from us. But I heard things. I overheard him talking on the phone with someone. He sounded desperate. It scared me, Inspector. Nolan leaned forward, his eyes locking with Meera's. Do you think your mother might have been involved in your father's disappearance? Meera looked shocked. No, my mother would never. She's not capable of that. Are you sure about that? Nolan pressed. Your mother found out about the affair. She had a motive. Did you notice anything strange in her behavior recently? Meera hesitated, biting her lip. She's been acting distant. Cold even. But I thought it was because of the affair. I didn't think she would do something like this. Nolan could see the doubt creeping into Meera's eyes. The family was unraveling, and the secrets were piling up. But there was one person left to question, Peter's business partner, Thomas, who might hold the final piece of the puzzle. Nolan decided it was time to confront Thomas again. There were too many loose threads, and Thomas had evaded some key questions during their first meeting. He returned to Thomas's office, determined to uncover the truth. As soon as Thomas saw Nolan walk in, his face went pale. Inspector, what brings you back? Nolan didn't waste time. I know about Peter's financial troubles. I know he was being pressured by dangerous people. What I don't know is how deep you were involved in all of it. Start talking, Thomas, and this will go a lot easier for you. Thomas stammered, his hands shaking as he wiped the sweat from his forehead. I didn't do anything, Inspector. I swear. Then tell me who Peter was meeting with. Who were these dangerous people? Thomas swallowed hard. It wasn't just one person. Peter had gotten involved with a man named Vishnu. Well, let's just say he's not someone you want to cross. Vishnu had loaned Peter a large sum of money to cover his debts, but Peter couldn't pay him back. Things were getting ugly. Did Vishnu threaten Peter? Nolan asked. Thomas nodded, his voice barely a whisper. Yes, several times. Peter was supposed to meet him the day before he disappeared. I don't know what happened during that meeting, but Peter was terrified. Nolan knew he was getting closer to the truth. Vishnu was a name that had come up in other criminal investigations before, and his reputation was as ruthless as it got. But Nolan wasn't convinced that Vishnu was the only culprit. Someone inside Peter's family had played a part in his disappearance. With this new information, Nolan prepared himself for the final confrontation, knowing that the answers lay somewhere within the tangled web of family betrayals and business deals gone wrong. Nolan left Thomas's office with a heavy sense of foreboding. Peter's connections to the notorious Vishnu were undoubtedly significant, but something still wasn't adding up. There was an underlying current of deception in the family, and Nolan was determined to expose it. The tension in the air was thick as he drove back to the Peter residence, mentally preparing for what he suspected was coming. As soon as he stepped into the house, Rajeev rushed toward him, his face pale with fear. Inspector Nolan, something's happened to Meera. He gasped. Nolan's heart raced. What happened? Where is she? Rajeev led him to the living room, where Meera was lying on the couch, her head bandaged. Blood was seeping through the bandage, and she looked dazed but conscious. Nolan crouched beside her. Meera, what happened? She winced as she tried to sit up. I was in my room. Someone came from behind and attacked me. I didn't see who it was. I blacked out after that. Did you hear anything? Anything at all that could help us identify the person? Nolan asked, his voice calm but insistent. Meera closed her eyes, trying to remember. There was a voice, a man's voice. He said something like, "This is your last warning." That's all I can recall. Nolan clenched his jaw. This wasn't a simple robbery or a random attack. Someone wanted Meera silenced. But why? And more importantly, how did it connect to Peter's disappearance? Nolan's suspicions that the family was deeply involved were growing stronger. He realized now that Meera held the key to unlocking the truth, whether she knew it or not. As Meera was taken to her room to rest, Nolan's mind whirled. The attacker's words echoed in his head. "This is your last warning." It was clear that someone was getting desperate, and that desperation could lead to mistakes. Later that evening, Nolan sat down with Rajeev and Sarada in the study. Sarada, still shaken by the attack on her daughter, looked more fragile than before, but Nolan was watching her carefully, noticing how Mrs. Peter, "Rajeev, there's something you both need to know," Nolan began, his tone serious. "Peter was in deep trouble with a man named Vishnu. I suspect that Vishnu or one of his associates could be responsible for your husband's disappearance." Rajiev's face darkened. "Vishnu? But I thought my father had settled his debts." Nolan shook his head. "That's what your father wanted you to believe. But he was in deeper than anyone realized. The money he borrowed was never paid back, and Vishnu doesn't forgive debts easily." Sarada remained silent, her hands trembling slightly as she held onto her shawl. "But there's more," Nolan continued. "This isn't just about Vishnu. There's another layer to this story, one that involves personal betrayal. Your father was having an affair, Mrs. Peter. I believe that affair is connected to his disappearance." Sarada's face went ashen, but she said nothing. Rajeev, on the other hand, looked stunned. "What?" Rajeev exclaimed, turning to his mother. "Did you know about this?" Sarada swallowed hard, tears welling up in her eyes. "I knew. I knew he was seeing someone else. I didn't care at first, but then it became clear that he was planning to leave. He was going to leave me and the family behind." Rajeev looked horrified. "And you didn't tell me?" "There was nothing to tell," Sarada whispered, her voice trembling. "He was slipping away from us, from all of us." Nolan watched the interaction carefully. Sarada's confession was heartfelt, but there was something off. She was hiding something, and Nolan was determined to find out what. Then, something clicked in his mind. The torn letter he had found in Peter's room. He pulled it out from his pocket and laid it on the table in front of them. "I found this in your husband's room. It's part of a letter, but it's incomplete. The message is clear enough. Someone had threatened your husband. Do either of you recognize this handwriting?" Rajeev shook his head, but Sarada's face paled even more. Her hand slowly reached out to touch the letter, her fingers trembling. "No, I don't recognize it," she said, but Nolan saw the lie in her eyes. Nolan decided to push her. "Mrs. Peter, I think you do know who wrote this letter. I think you know a lot more than you're admitting." Sarada's hands shook violently now, and Rajeev looked at her, confused. "Mom? What's going on?" Sarada stood up suddenly, her face contorted with fear. I need to lie down. Please excuse me." She hurried out of the room before Nolan could stop her. Rajeev watched her leave, his face clouded with confusion and frustration. "What's happening, Inspector? My mother seems so disconnected from all of this." Nolan stood up as well, his mind working fast. "Your mother knows more than she's saying, Rajeev. I'm sure of it. And the fact that Meera was attacked suggests that the danger is far from over." Rajeev looked down, clenching his fists. "But my mother wouldn't harm anyone." "She couldn't." Nolan's expression was unreadable as he considered the possibility. "I'm not saying she did, but there's something she's hiding. And until I figure out what that is, none of you are safe." Nolan left the study and headed upstairs to check on Meera. As he approached her room, he noticed that the door was ajar. His instincts kicked in. He pushed the door open carefully, scanning the room. To his shock, he found Sarada sitting next to Meera's bed, clutching Meera's hand tightly, whispering something in her ear. Meera looked scared, her eyes wide, as she stared at her mother. "Mrs. Peter, what are you doing?" Nolan's voice was sharp. Sarada jerked back, her face filled with panic. I was just making sure she's okay." Nolan stepped forward, his gaze piercing. "I'm not sure you're telling the truth, Mrs. Peter." Sarada stood up, backing away from the bed. I don't know what you're implying, Inspector, but I would never hurt my daughter. Nolan's patience was running thin. Mrs. Peter, this isn't about hurt. This is about the truth. Your husband was involved in dangerous activities, and you knew about it. You may not have been the one to physically harm him, but you know who did. Sarada's face crumpled, and she sank into a nearby chair. Tears streamed down her cheeks. I never wanted any of this to happen. I just wanted him to stop. Stop what? Nolan asked, his voice softening. Stop everything, Sarada sobbed. The business, the lies, the affair, everything. It was tearing our family apart. I thought if I threatened him, if I scared him, maybe he would change. But I didn't think it would go this far. Nolan's heart sank. The letter, the threats, it all made sense now. Sarada had been the one to threaten Peter, hoping it would force him to abandon his plans. But it had backfired, spiraling out of control into something far more dangerous. You sent that letter, Nolan said quietly. Sarada nodded, her face buried in her hands. Yes, but I didn't want him to disappear. I just wanted him to stop. Nolan glanced at Meera, who was staring at her mother in shock. But someone else took advantage of the situation, didn't they? He said, piecing it together. Someone close to Peter, someone who saw the opportunity. Suddenly, it hit Nolan like a bolt of lightning. Nolan stood frozen for a moment, as everything came together in his mind. It was all too perfect, the debts, the affair, the threats from Vishnu, and Sarada's desperate attempts to save her crumbling family. But none of these directly explained Peter's disappearance. There was someone else in the shadows, orchestrating this entire plot. Nolan's eyes sharpened, and he knew exactly who to confront next. Rajeev, Nolan called, his voice commanding, as he stepped out of Meera's room. Rajeev appeared at the top of the staircase, looking tired and worn. I need you to gather everyone in the living room. It's time to get some answers. Within minutes, the entire family, including a visibly shaken Sarada, was seated in the large, dimly lit living room. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Meera was still recovering, her head wrapped in bandages, while Sarada sat close to her, looking defeated. Rajeev stood near the window, his arms crossed, clearly frustrated by the lack of progress in the investigation. Nolan paced in front of them, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze intense. He wasn't interested in small talk anymore. He was about to lay all the cards on the table. We've spent the last few days focusing on external threats, Vishnu, and the dangerous world Peter got involved with, Nolan began. But what we've overlooked is the most important piece of the puzzle, the family itself. All of you had something to lose if Peter left, didn't you? Sarada looked down, her eyes filling with guilt, while Meera bit her lip nervously. Rajeev remained still, staring out of the window, seemingly lost in thought. Nolan continued, his voice growing firmer. Sarada, you sent Peter that threatening letter, hoping it would scare him into stopping his affair and abandoning his plans to leave the family. But you weren't the one who made him disappear. No, someone else seized that opportunity. Nolan turned his gaze toward Rajeev, his eyes narrowing. Rajeev, you knew about everything, didn't you? Rajeev spun around, shocked. What are you talking about, Inspector? I knew about some of the debts, sure, but I didn't. Don't lie to me. Nolan barked, his patience gone. You overheard your father's conversations. You knew about the debts, the affair, and the threats he was facing. You also knew that your father was preparing to take drastic action, maybe even flee with that woman, leaving you and the family behind in ruin. You were the one with the most to lose. Rajeev's face drained of color, but he stood firm. Inspector, I don't know what you're accusing me of, but I would never hurt my father. Nolan stepped closer, his voice now deadly calm. You didn't need to physically hurt him. All you had to do was stage the perfect disappearance. You had the motive, the fear of losing everything. You had the opportunity, you were with your father that night, you knew his every move. And finally, you had the plan. When your mother's threats failed to stop him, you took matters into your own hands. Nolan turned to the rest of the family. Rajeev engineered Peter's disappearance to look like a kidnapping or a murder, hoping the family would believe that Vishnu or some external force was responsible. But it wasn't just about fear of losing the business, was it, Rajeev? There's more. Tell them. Rajeev's jaw clenched, and for a moment, he looked ready to deny everything. But then, in a moment of sheer frustration, he snapped. Fine. Yes, I knew about the affair. I knew my father was planning to leave us behind and run away with her. I couldn't stand it, Inspector. I couldn't let him destroy everything we'd built. Rajiev's voice cracked as he confessed. But I didn't kill him. I swear, I didn't hurt him. I just wanted him to disappear for a while. I wanted to scare him into coming back. I contacted one of Vishnu's men, someone I knew was desperate for money. I thought if I could make it look like a kidnapping, we could negotiate, pay the ransom, and my father would come back. But it spiraled out of control. Nolan's suspicions were confirmed. You set up a fake kidnapping, didn't you, Rajeev? You thought you could control the situation, but you had no idea what you were dealing with. The man you hired was far more dangerous than you realized. Rajeev buried his face in his hands. I didn't know they'd actually take him. I thought it would be a bluff, just long enough to make my father come to his senses. Sarada gasped, horrified. Rajeev, how could you? Nolan stepped closer, his voice filled with urgency. Rajeev, where is your father? Do you know where they've taken him? Rajeev shook his head, his voice barely audible. No. After I set up the meeting, I lost contact with them. They said they'd handle it from there. But now I don't know where he is. Nolan felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the break he needed, but time was running out. Peter was still alive somewhere, and Nolan needed to find him before things took a deadly turn. Without wasting another moment, Nolan turned to his assistant, who'd been standing silently in the corner. Called the station. We need to track down Vishnu's men now. Hours later, Nolan, along with a team of officers, raided an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Based on the information they had gathered, it was likely that Peter was being held there. As they approached the warehouse, Nolan's heart pounded in his chest. This was their last chance. The officers stormed in, guns raised, ready for a fight. Inside, they found Peter tied to a chair, battered but alive. Vishnu's men had fled, abandoning Peter when they realized the police were closing in. Peter was rushed to the hospital, weak but conscious. When Nolan spoke to him later, Peter looked more broken than he ever had before. I never thought it would come to this, Peter whispered, his voice hoarse. I was ready to leave everything behind, but I didn't realize the damage I'd caused until it was too late. Nolan nodded solemnly. You've hurt your family in ways you can't imagine, Peter. But at least you're alive. That's something. Back at the Peter residence, the atmosphere was tense. Rajeev was arrested for his role in orchestrating the fake kidnapping, though his remorse was evident. Sarada and Meera were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered family. As Nolan left the house, he couldn't help but reflect on the case. It wasn't just greed or betrayal that had driven the family to this point. It was a combination of lies, fear, and desperation. In the end, it was a stark reminder of how fragile even the strongest families could be when secrets fester beneath the surface. But for Nolan, justice had been served, and that was all that mattered.
Please subscribe and follow. See you in next video.